History is often written with grand narratives of progress and triumph, but it also harbors dark chapters filled with unimaginable suffering and human cruelty. The Nazino Tragedy, a horrific event that unfolded in the Soviet Union in 1933, is one such chapter. A chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of political extremism and social engineering gone wrong. In this video, we'll delve into the disturbing details of the Nazino Tragedy, exploring its historical context, the events that led to the deportation of thousands of undesirables to a remote Siberian island, and the horrific conditions they faced, including starvation, disease, and even cannibalism. We'll also examine the political and social climate of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the policies that led to this tragedy, and the individuals and institutions responsible for its orchestration and execution. And we'll consider the legacy of the Nazino Tragedy, its impact on the historical memory of the Soviet Union, and the importance of remembering such atrocities to prevent their reoccurrence. And who knows? Perhaps the next big discovery in historical research will be made by someone watching this video right now. In 1933, amidst the turmoil of Stalin's collectivization policies and the resulting famine, thousands of individuals deemed undesirable were forcibly deported to a remote island in Siberia. These deportees, a diverse group including petty criminals, political dissidents, and those accused of social parasitism, were herded onto barges and transported to the Nazino Island, a desolate and inhospitable land in the middle of the Ob River. Upon arrival, they were abandoned with minimal supplies, little to no tools, and inadequate clothing or shelter to survive the harsh Siberian climate. The authorities' plan was for these deportees to establish a special settlement and cultivate the island, contributing to the Soviet Union's agriculture production. However, the reality of the Nazino Island was far from the idolized vision of the authorities. The lack of food, shelter, and basic necessities quickly led to a humanitarian catastrophe. Disease, starvation, and violence became rampant as the deportees struggled to survive in desperate conditions. The situation deteriorated further, with reports of cannibalism emerging as the starving deportees resorted to desperate measures to stay alive. The island, once intended as a site for agricultural development, became a scene of unimaginable suffering and death. Within just 13 weeks, over 4,000 of the deportees had perished or disappeared. The majority of the survivors were in a state of severe malnutrition and illness, their bodies and minds scarred by the trauma they had endured. Those who attempted to escape the island were met with brutal force. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, shooting anyone who tried to flee, further highlighting the dehumanizing and oppressive nature of this forced exile. The Nazino Tragedy remained largely hidden from public view for decades. The Soviet government, eager to conceal its role in this horrific event, suppressed information about the tragedy and punished those who had dared to speak out. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the truth about the Nazino Tragedy began to emerge. The human rights organization Memorial played a crucial role in the uncovering and publicizing the details of this forgotten atrocity. A Soviet propaganda worker who documented the horrific conditions on Nazino Island further exposed the government's complicity in this tragedy. The Nazino Tragedy was a direct result of a grand scheme devised by the Soviet authorities to relocate vast numbers of people to Siberia and Kazakhstan. The Nazino Tragedy was a direct result of a grand scheme devised by the Soviet authorities to relocate vast numbers of people to Siberia and Kazakhstan. In February 1933, Genrikh Yagata, the head of the OGPU, the secret police, and Matvey Berman, the head of the Gulag labor camp system, proposed a plan to Joseph Stalin to resettle up to 2 million people to these remote regions. The goal was to transform these sparsely populated areas into productive agricultural lands. The deportees, labeled settlers, were expected to cultivate over 1 million hectares of virgin island and become self-sufficient within 2 years. This ambitious plan was based on the earlier experience of deporting millions of kulaks, which were wealthy peasants and other agricultural workers, to similar regions as part of the dekulakization policy, a brutal campaign to eliminate private land ownership and collectivize agriculture. However, unlike the previous deportations, this new plan faced a critical challenge. the Soviet Union was in the midst of a devastating famine, caused by the forced collectivization of agriculture and the government's mismanagement of food resources. This meant that the resources available to support the new settlers were severely limited. Despite these concerns, the plan was approved by the Council of People's Commissars in March 1933, driven by the government's desire to increase agricultural production and assert control over remote regions. However, the number of deportees was soon reduced to 1 million, likely due to the realization of the logistical challenges and limited resources available. The individuals swept up in the Nazino Tragedy were not hardened criminals or enemies of the state, but rather ordinary people deemed undesirable by the Soviet regime. The original plan for the special settlements targeted specific groups, primarily kulaks and those residing in agricultural regions of the Soviet Union's western territories, such as Ukraine and the fertile Black Earth region. These individuals were seen as obstacles to the collectivization of agriculture, a key component of Stalin's economic policies. However, the actual deportees who were sent to Nazino Island were a different group altogether. Many of them were residents of Moscow, Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and other major cities who had been unable to obtain internal passports. In 1932, the Soviet government launched a passportization campaign, requiring all residents of major cities to obtain internal passports. This campaign was partially aimed at controlling population movement and cleansing urban centers of individuals deemed superfluous or socially dangerous. Those who were denied passports included a wide range of people. Former merchants and traders seen as remnants of the capitalist past, peasants who had fled the famine in the countryside seeking refuge and food in the cities, petty criminals and those deemed antisocial or socially harmful, and really anyone who didn't fit the idolized image of the Soviet worker. These individuals, denied passports and labeled as D-classed elements, were subject to arrest and deportation from the cities. Most were deported within 2 days of their arrest, with little opportunity to appeal or challenge their designation. Between March and July of 1933, tens of thousands of people were deported from Moscow and Leningrad alone. Those arrested in Moscow before May 1st, 1933, were sent to a transit camp in Tomsk, a city in western Siberia, where they were held before being further transported to Nazino Island. The journey to Nazino Island was a harrowing experience for the deportees, marked by overcrowding, starvation, and violence. The Soviet authorities, in their haste to relocate these undesirable individuals, showed a callous disregard for their basic needs and well-being. The deportees were herded onto trains and transported to the city of Tomsk in western Siberia. The transit camp in Tomsk, intended to hold 15,000 people, was overwhelmed by the arrival of over 25,000 deportees in April, even before it was officially completed. The conditions in the camp were deplorable, with overcrowding, lack of sanitization, and inadequate food and medical care. The deportees, many of whom were already weakened by hunger and illness, suffered greatly during their stay in Tomsk. The local authorities, unprepared for the influx of deportees and fearful of their perceived criminal and antisocial nature, decided to send them to the most isolated work sites. Nazino Island, a remote and inhospitable island in the Ob River, was chosen as their destination. On May 14th, 4 river barges designed for hauling timber were loaded with approximately 5,000 deportees. These barges, lacking basic amenities and provisions, became floating prisons, carrying the deportees on a journey into a nightmare. The conditions on the barges were horrific. The deportees were crammed together below deck with little ventilation or sanitization. Food was scarce, with a meager daily ration of 200 grams of bread per person. The only other provision was 20 tons of flour, but there were no cooking utensils or tools to prepare it. The guards and supervisors on the barges were also ill-equipped and inexperienced. They were new recruits, lacking proper uniforms or even shoes, and they had no experience in managing or caring for such a large and diverse group of deportees. The journey to Nazino Island, which lasted several days, was a brutal and dehumanizing experience. The deportees, already weakened by hunger and illness, suffered further from the harsh conditions, the lack of food and water, and the rampant violence and theft among the prisoners. The arrival of the deportees on Nazino Island marked the beginning of a horrific chapter in human history. The island, a desolate and swampy piece of land in the middle of the Ob River, became a stage for unimaginable suffering and brutality. The deportees, numbering over 4,500 men and 322 women, were dumped on the island with little more than 20 tons of flour and no tools, cooking utensils, or proper shelter. Many were already weak and ill from their journey, and the lack of basic necessities quickly led to chaos and despair. The flour, intended to sustain the deportees, became a source of conflict and violence. Fights erupted as people desperately tried to secure their share, and the guards, ill-equipped and inexperienced, resorted to firing on the crowd to maintain order. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The deportees, mostly city dwellers with no knowledge of agriculture or survival skills, were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions on the island. Disease, starvation, and violence became rampant as gangs formed and preyed on the weak and vulnerable. The island descended into a lawless and brutal state. People were murdered for food, money, or even gold teeth fillings, which became a form of currency in the desperate environment. The guards, while tasked with maintaining order, were often complicit in the violence and extortion, turning a blind eye to the suffering and brutality around them. As the death toll mounted, cannibalism became a grim reality. Desperate and starving, some deportees resorted to consuming the flesh of the dead, and eventually even began killing each other for food. The island became a living nightmare, a testament to the cruelty and indifference of the Soviet regime. The Nazino Tragedy finally came to an end in early June 1933 when the authorities decided to dissolve the settlement on the island. The surviving 2,856 deportees were transferred to smaller settlements upstream on the Nazino River, leaving behind 157 individuals who were still too ill to be moved. However, the suffering didn't end with evacuation. Hundreds more deportees perished during the transfer, succumbing to their weakened state and the harsh conditions. Those who survived found themselves in new settlements with limited resources, inadequate food, and a rampant typhus outbreak. Many refused to work, their spirits broken by the trauma they had endured on the Nazino island. In early July, new settlements were constructed using non-deportee labor, but only a small fraction of the Nazino survivors were transferred to these improved locations. Instead, thousands of new deportees from Tomsk were housed in these new settlements, highlighting the ongoing cycle of forced resettlement and the Soviet government's disregard for human life. The Nazino Tragedy, with its staggering death toll and unimaginable suffering, exposed the flaws and brutality of the Soviet regime's social engineering policies. It also revealed the government's incompetence and indifference in managing these forced relocations. The official report on the Nazino incident, compiled by Vasily Velechko and sent to Stalin, painted a grim picture of the conditions on the island. It documented the lack of shelter, the starvation, the violence, and the rampant cannibalism that had taken place. The report's findings led to a commission by the Communist Party to investigate the affair. The commission's report, while attempting to downplay the severity of the situation, ultimately confirmed the horrific conditions and the high death toll. Local officials and guards who attempted to dispute Velechko's account were reprimanded and even imprisoned, further demonstrating the government's desire to control the narrative and suppress dissent. The Nazino Tragedy had a profound impact on the Soviet leadership, leading them to question the feasibility and effectiveness of their large-scale resettlement plans. The high number of untraceable settlers and the Nazino incident itself exposed the flaws in their approach and the devastating consequences of their policies. The Nazino Tragedy remained hidden in the shadows for decades. The Soviet government, eager to conceal its role in this horrific event, suppressed all information about it, punishing those who dared to speak out. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the truth about the Nazino island began to emerge. Through interviews with survivors and witnesses, Memorial pieced together the harrowing story of the deportees' suffering and the government's complicity in their tragic fate. One eyewitness account shared with Memorial in 1989 painted a grim picture of the desperation and brutality on the island. They were trying to escape. They asked us, "Where's the railway?" "We'd never seen a railway." They asked, "Where's Moscow? Leningrad?" They were asking the wrong people. "We never heard of those places." "We're Ostiaks." People were running away starving. They were given a handful of flour. They mixed it with water and drank it, and then they immediately got diarrhea. The things we saw. People were dying everywhere. They were killing each other. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Vinnikov, a young fellow. He fell in love with a girl who had been sent there and was courting her. He protected her. One day, he had to be away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, "Take care of her." But with all the people there, the comrade couldn't do much really. People caught the girl, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. Everything. Everything. They were hungry. They had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. This heartbreaking account, along with other testimonies and documents uncovered by Memorial, revealed the full extent of the horror that unfolded on Nazino Island. In 2006, French historian Nicholas Wirth, who had previously co-authored The Black Book of Communism, published Cannibal Island, a comprehensive account of the Nazino tragedy. This book, based on extensive research and interviews with survivors, brought the story to a wider audience and sparked renewed interest in this dark chapter of the Soviet history. A documentary film based on Wirth's book, Cannibal Island, was released in 2009, further amplifying the story's reach and impact. The rediscovery and documentation of the Nazino tragedy serves as a testament to the importance of historical memory, the pursuit of justice, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to let such atrocities be forgotten. The Nazino tragedy stands as a stark and chilling reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise from political extremism, social engineering gone awry, and a disregard for human life and dignity. The suffering and death inflicted upon the deportees on Nazino Island serves as a testament to the importance of compassion, empathy, and respect for human rights in any system of governance. By confronting the darkest chapters of history, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and strive to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The Nazino tragedy also highlights the importance of historical memory and the need to challenge official narratives that seek to conceal or downplay uncomfortable truths. By remembering and acknowledging the suffering of the victims, we can honor their memory and contribute to a more just and compassionate future. If this exploration of the Nazino tragedy has moved you, I encourage you to delve deeper into this dark chapter of history. Learn more about the victims, the circumstances that led to their tragic fate, and the ongoing efforts to ensure that such events are never repeated. And remember, the pursuit of a better world requires a commitment to human rights, social justice, and the recognition of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. By remembering the lessons of the past and actively working towards a more just and compassionate future, we can honor the victims of the Nazino tragedy and contribute to a world where such horrors are co-signed to the history books, never to be repeated. Thank you everyone for watching. My name's The Big Y. Don't forget to drop a like, and if you're new to the Why Not family, a follow. And I'll catch you guys in the next video.